This is the Page Publishing Book Club. But you knew that as soon as you heard the music. Am I right, Rob? Absolutely. I'm your host, Alice Stockton Rossini. We got a couple of authors here tonight determined to inspire kids to read about history. You know how the saying goes. If we don't learn from history, we are doomed to repeat it. And what better way to get kids interested than by intertwining historical facts with a great story? We begin with Nick West. He grew up on a farm in Central Florida and collected hundreds of these arrow points. Now, imagine if these arrow points could talk and tell the story of their Indian tribes, how they lived, how they felt when the Europeans invaded their homeland, and you'll get the idea of Nick's book entitled To Light a New Fire. Nick, what did you find out when you got these arrow points checked out?
Actually, I was shocked to find out that some of them were as new as 400 years ago, and some of them were as old as 4,000 years ago.
Wow.
So I was amazed to find that people had been living in this part of Central Florida all that time. And so I wanted to write about the Native American tribe that actually lived in the Gainesville area during the time of the first European contact, which was the mid-1500s. So the Patano tribe, which were the part of the Timucuan-speaking people. And so I wanted to write a historical novel based on the lives of those people. And I was fortunate enough to have some people here at the University of Florida who had literally dedicated their whole career in the study of those native people here in this part of the state. So I had a tremendous amount of resources available to me about what they ate, what they hunted, how they lived, how they constructed their homes, their lifestyle. That's basically what the background of this book was about. And so that's the way I wanted to write this book, bringing these people back to life, what they were thinking, how they were feeling the first time they saw a Spanish group of soldiers come through their neighborhood, first time they ever saw a sailing ship on the coast. It was very similar to what we might feel if a UFO landed in the middle of one of our cities and decided that this was going to be their land from now on, and what our reaction would be is sort of what they went through at that time. It's an interesting thing. There were about 20,000 Native Americans living in the state of Florida at the time of first European contact, and within 250 years they were all gone.
Oh my God.
And they had been living here for thousands and thousands of years. It didn't take long to make a complete change. And I tried to point out, because these people were explorers and they were finding what they considered a new world. Really, the chief characters in my book are the Native Americans who lived here, along with a young French cabin boy who got stranded here over in the St. Augustine area when he was ashore and the ship had to leave because of the Spanish people were after him. And so he was sort of left behind, and he ended up living with the local Indians for the rest of his life. And so he's one of the principal characters. So I tried to present it from his point of view as a European, great adventure, finding new lands. And then when he got here, discovered that there were people already living here, and he developed quite an affinity for them after he was, through a matter of fate, forced to live with them.
So is this his story?
He's one of the three main characters. There was Nasu, who is a young Indian man who was about 18 or 19. And the various tribes of Indians in the state of Florida, they had traders, and they would trade with other neighboring villages. And his uncle was a trader, and he wanted to be, because they got to visit all these other villages. So he trained and became a trader. And his trading trips took him over to the coast, which is in the St. Augustine area, to trade with the Native Americans who lived on the coast. And also by tradition, if they could find a wife or a husband outside of their own tribe, it was always looked on as a good thing to do, because it expanded their bloodline. And he fell in love with a young girl that lived on the coast, and her name was Kato. His name was Nasu. And on one of his trading trips to that area. When he got there, he witnessed the arrival of a French ship along the coast, and so he wants to take the young girl that he's going to marry. He wants to take her back inland to get her away from the coast because he thought she'd be safer there. Asked her father if he could marry her and take her back, and as they were leaving to come back to the central part of the state, that was when the young French boy got separated from his ship, and their paths crossed out in the wilderness. The French boy was lost, and they were on the way home and found him. So that's sort of how their stories came together. So those are the three main characters.
You've got a great story, and you've got a real nice way of talking about it, and a lot of research. You've done a great job.
I've been very pleased with the response, and one of the nicest letters I got was from a young lady that said that she wished that she had this book when she was in school studying history, because she fell in love with the characters and learned all about them, and learned more in reading this historical fiction than she learned through college and studying the history of that period. So that's always a compliment that I will take.
As well you should. It's the best compliment of all. Thanks, Nick. Leave it to two history teachers to find a unique way to get kids interested in finding out more about historical events by throwing in a little science and a lot of imagination. Brenda Heller and Jimmy Adams have conceived The Time Worm.
Okay, the story starts with a boy from the future, and his name is Theo. He's 17 years old, and he's a typical teenager. He's into holo games. He's prompted by his dad to be on time for things. But because he's from the future, he has a robot maid, and his mother has passed, and so the robot pretty much tells him what to do. And besides the holo games, he likes riding his, we call it a drift board, which is a board that actually hovers above the ground, like a skateboard. And so anyway, he's helping his dad with an invention, and his dad and a fellow scientist have created a time machine. And there becomes a little bit of a dispute over the time machine. The dad doesn't think it's fit to tear people apart and send them through time, but we find out later there are ulterior motives. The fellow scientist has ties to Nazi Germany. And there's a book involved that makes the boy need to follow back in the Time Worm. Time Worm is the name of the machine. And he also has his robot dog with him, Murphy. And so he travels back, and Theo, the 17-year-old boy, ends up in a concentration camp for children in Nazi Germany. And that particular story is an actual event that actually happened in history. A lot of the events in the story are events that have actually happened. And so we hope that it stimulates enough curiosity that people who read, whether it's students or adults, want to go ahead and research and look into it. So he travels back, and by a series of events, he meets a young girl, of course, in Nazi Germany, and they go through various places on a mission to recover this book that has all kinds of secrets so that history cannot be rewritten. This is the first in a series of 3. So Time Worm actually ends in Frankfurt, and the boy is looking out across the city. The boy says, "Why do you do all of this? Why do you keep fighting?" And the man says, "Look out across this countryside. This is why we do it. We do it for the people." Our driving force behind this is to get people to understand the past. Not only that, but you can't take a country and say the country is bad. You can't say Germany is bad in 1930s. You can say the regime or the Reich is bad, but you can't say that all of the people are bad. And we want people to understand that. It's what you stand for. So it's kind of got a little moral lesson going underneath all of this too.
How are you getting the word out?
We are doing book signings. We we have it on all types of social media.
Yeah, the last big one we did was the Kansas Book Festival, and we got invited to come to there, and history conference we just did.
Anything to get kids interested in history, anything to get them to delve further into our past is a good thing.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to hope for. Have the kid come in and actually say that to me. She's like, "Oh, all these people real?" I'm like, "Well, about 99% of them are real people." So, and then she's like, "Well, I had to go look them up." And that was kind of like my woohoo moment.
Hey, who doesn't love a woohoo moment? Odie Speaks for the first time about Brothers and Sisters. It's the brainchild of Barbara Davis, who's determined to share some lessons with kids young and old. Barbara.
Well, it's actually loosely based on my 3 children and our standard poodle, Odie. And I had been home with them for a number of years, and I always wanted to be an author at some point. And I thought this was the best time to start. So they inspired the first, and it is, yes, a series.
Were you taking notes along the way in preparation for one day writing this book?
No, actually, I wasn't. It just sort of hit me. And now what I do is I look for specific topics or subjects that I can tie the children and the dog into. So it's based on different conundrums that children or siblings might come into.
Give me a conundrum.
Looking at specific relationships in a family in relation to sibling rivalry, or a conundrum that the children might get themselves into maybe while they're playing and realize that they have to work together in order to solve the problem. And that's sort of the common thread that I use.
Are you out reading these books to kids?
I am, and I love doing it. That's my favorite thing to do. So I love to read to preschoolers, and another fun thing that I do is I will have events with retirement communities. And a lot of them in this area are linked to Montessori schools or different preschools. And so they'll invite the children to come in. And so then I get both audiences at the same time, which is a lot of fun. And then it provides a great interaction time between the children and the elderly residents.
That's great. Did you just go out and do that on your own?
I did. I do all my own marketing. So I network and go out to various bookstores and preschools, moms groups, and different types of organizations that I think would be a good fit for the audience of this book.
So you go out and you chat it up.
I do. It's my favorite thing to do.
You know what? It's the most difficult thing for most authors to do. I will ask every week. I talk to authors, and every week I get, they're reluctant to.
You're kidding.
No, it's really hard for them. So I need you to give them a pep talk. Tell them what they should do.
Well, I think the most important thing, I will say, I have to backtrack. I will say the first book I wrote was more on a personal level, and I will admit that one has been hard for me to market. And I think that could be the hang up. If an author is writing something that's very personal to their life walk or their story, it can be difficult because you're opening yourself up to strangers and you are opening yourself up to criticism. But I've been able to get past that a little bit, and I think you have to really just look at your book as a separate entity. It comes to life once it's published. So I like to say they stand on their own. So they're completely independent from us at that point. It's kind of like raising a child, and all of a sudden you have to let it go. You have to let it be independent, and you have to distance yourself enough so that you can speak about it from a third person perspective, and you have to let go of that personalization. I think that's the biggest thing.
All right. Thank you for that. Something to chew on, Page Publishing faithful, while we pause for a word from our sponsor. We'll be back right after this.
Have you written a book and want to get it published? Then now's the time to call Page Publishing at 800-204-6099 and do it immediately. You see, they're looking for authors of all types of books, and unlike most publishers, Page Publishing will take the time to review most of the books submitted to them, and they'll even give you their feedback. And if they like what they read, Page Publishing will get your book into bookstores and for sale online at Amazon, the Apple iTunes Store, and other outlets. They'll handle everything: copyright protection, printing, cover art, publicity, and editing. So if you've written a novel, a children's book, a cookbook, inspirational work, a book of poetry, or biography, and want to get it published, then you need to call Page Publishing and do it immediately. Call 800-204-6099 now for your free author submission kit. Your road to fame and fortune could very well start with this simple phone call. For your free author submission kit, call Page Publishing at 800-204-6099.
And we're back on the Page Publishing Book Club. I'm your host, Alice Stockton Rossini. Joe Swenson has written poems and plays, but this is his first published novel about a little girl, telepathy, and deja vu. It's entitled Letter Number 3, and this kind of came to you in a flash, right?
I wrote the book in 27 days, but then I reread it like 345 times at least.
You must have had some inspiration to write it in 27 days.
You know, it's funny because I have been sitting on this book idea for almost 4 years, but I couldn't figure out the perspective to write it from.
What's this book about? What's the story?
12-year-old Stephanie Joy Bradley may or may not be telepathic. And so she has this event that takes place in a grocery store about 13 months prior to where the book picks up. And where a woman in a business suit says something, but it's not, she didn't say it with her mouth. She says, I wonder if she knows. And it envelops Stephanie's head. And it's a completely different sensation than she'd ever experienced before. And she obsesses over it for the next 13 months, getting, because she was obsessing over it, she gained a lot more knowledge a little bit faster than most 12-year-olds would, but still has that innocence and everything about her, wondering if she's telepathic. So she does research on telepathy. She picks up books and reads books on telepathy. She goes on internet website searches and until another event happens, this time in her school, where a girl says, again in her mind, he doesn't like you. So she's, again, just thrown, because at this, she has basically convinced herself that she's crazy. She's a crazy 12-year-old and she just needs to move on, or does she move on? So there's this whole mystery about telepathy that happens. And once the telepathic doors open, then it becomes this whole different thing. And here's the thing is I paint the picture of telepathy as a thought that you have to push out of the dominant side of your mind. And telepaths can only speak to other telepaths. So I create this whole world of telepathy that is built on these very specific rules. There's actually 6 different telepathic abilities, but each person has a different varying level of these abilities, except for Stephanie, who seems to have all of the abilities. And there's even more. There's mystery about her family. There's mystery about how she friends one of the boys in the books. So it's, I don't know. I'm very excited about this.
Are you telepathic?
No. You have those moments, right? Where you're like, man, I know. You have those deja vu moments. And that's kind of what I play on with Stephanie, because she has that moment. And that moment drives every single moment. It helps her unravel several mysteries. Like one of the mysteries is her parents. So I paint the rule that telepathy is genetic, but neither of her parents are telepathic. And so the reader, as you're reading along, you kind of get this idea, wait a second. Well, how is that possible? And then there are moments where, okay, well, maybe the mom is telepathic because of certain events that take place. And what I try to do is I try to confuse intuition with telepathy. And by fusing these two kind of ideals together, you get to an outcome that is reasonable for the reader until the major plot twist happens at the end. And that's what letter number 3 is. So letter number 3 is the ultimate mystery of the entire book. Okay. And telepathy just happens to play a role in it. And once the mystery of letter number 3 is completely solved, that's when this book ends. It's a huge cliffhanger at the end. Ooh. So far, the reader response has been, oh my gosh, I have to pick up. You have to tell me what is going on in book 2.
So you have a following?
I do. Yes, I do have a following.
How'd that happen?
So I'm an actor. I do a lot of commercial acting. I live in Maine, so people know me that way. I do a lot of local theater. I direct stuff. So I'm a very public person. So I do, I do readings. I do some book signings, and I've read like different chapters of the first book on Facebook, on my Facebook page, so stuff like that. So I've developed a little bit of a following, and everybody that reads the book says basically the same exact thing. They fall in love with Stephanie Joy Bradley, and you fall in love with several of the other characters because these characters represent everyone.
All right, Joe. I love your enthusiasm. Good luck. Sasquatch is the subject of John Van Deventer's book entitled Relics, A Myth You Don't Believe, A Reality You Won't Survive. And you had an interesting, inspirational moment now, didn't you?
How I got started on it, some buddies and I were playing an online flight sim, and they started talking about Sasquatch, and we got jumped by some other guys, and they kind of flew off safely, and I got jumped by the other guys. I got mad at them and kind of logged off. Then the next day, got on with my friend and said, hey, sorry about that. Tell me about your Bigfoot story. And so I just kept sending him links on Bigfoot, because he was interested in it. I'd mentioned to him that I had tried to write a book in the 90s, and I thought, well, this is pretty cool. He told me, he started sending me links to, about supposed sightings and incidents. And I thought, well, wow, that would make a pretty good book. So I started writing this story. It took me a little over 2 years, but I got it done.
Well, geez, you have, this small town police chief, a death of outlaw motorcycle club members, an old flame returning with her husband that just throws this guy into a tailspin, strange animal behavior. I mean, there's all this.
Well, I think it's, a young middle-aged man he's had a fairly adventurous life, and he's a small town police officer, and these things start happening. It takes place in southeastern Oklahoma, supposedly an area of Sasquatch activity. I never knew that until I started doing a little research. And the very first thing that happens is there's an airplane crash. It starts a forest fire, and it pushes these 4 creatures into the area around Tallahena, Oklahoma. And as the book progresses, you figure out that they're not full grown or fully mature Sasquatch. They're kind of juveniles. So they really don't have any leadership, and they don't know as much to avoid mankind. They kind of just keep clashing. They're hungry. They're lost. They're just kind of making their way as best they can. And, they initially they run into the worst kind of, encounter you could have with some humans that are armed and got an attitude and aren't going to back down. Neither side's going to back down. And, so the bikers kind of come out on the losing end. And as Sam, the main character and the police chief, starts investigating, to him it looks like some maybe drug violence or something like that. But he is baffled that, there's no evidence that somebody else had guns, and all of a sudden the federal government moves in and takes a case away from him, and he's kind of curious about that, but he tries to, just do his job and stay out of the way. And in the meantime, a couple more bikers show up from that same group, upset about, their brothers being killed, and they're just kind of there to make a point, and they end up clashing with the police and getting arrested. And basically, they're bailed out of jail by Sam's worst enemy, who's married to his old high school flame.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, so things just kind of start going downhill from there. And Sam's distracted by the crime going on. He just sees it as crime. And his father, who's a full-blooded Choctaw, they have their beliefs about the Sasquatch phenomenon. As a lot of American Indian have stories about these things and that they've passed down over their generations. And this was something I wasn't aware of either until I started researching the book, and I thought it was pretty fascinating. And so you kind of got the old ways clashing with the new ways.
All right, John. Very interesting. Thank you. Finally, 12 and 20, a Vietnam War novel, is a story written by James Toomey based on his personal experience as a U.S. Marine in Vietnam, 12 months and 20 days that changed his life forever. James.
About a young man that joined the Marines at 17, and he went to Paris Island, and then he went to Vietnam, and that's the story of this kid's life over in Vietnam in those 13 months. His name is Sean Patrick O'Hara from South Boston, Mass.
You talk about the psychological scars of these hellacious 385 days and how he was given an education that included the sight of his fellow Marines being blown up and indigenous villages tortured. And you suggest that he was ready to do battle physically, but maybe not mentally, and this experience changed his life forever.
That's true.
Is that based on your experience?
Pretty much. It starts with this guy going to Vietnam, and it tells what he did for those 385 days. It tells you how the average Marine anyway in the infantry felt, during his tour in Vietnam.
How did he feel during his tour in Vietnam? Did he feel it was a worthless war?
Sometimes it was ambivalent. Sometimes he questioned the loyalty to the country, and then he was upset with the protests back home because he felt the protests were helping the enemy rather than him. Of course, now he's a 19-year-old kid in Vietnam, and he has different thoughts at that time, which might be different than today.
Does the story tell us, it sounds like he comes out of the service a broken man. Does the story tell us how he recovers from that?
No, I did the ending on purpose. You don't know if he got killed or not. So if there was another sequel or whatever, then we could go. We could go with that. But you can't tell if he died or if he lived.
Is there going to be a sequel?
I don't know. We'll see how this goes. Really, I started this book a long, long time ago, maybe 1970, 1972. And then I wrote another one earlier in 96, The Forsaken Patrols. I just held off on this until recently. It was like the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War.
You started thinking about it and decided to pull out that manuscript and finish it.
Yes.
What did you end up doing with your life after you got out of the service?
I ended up going on the Mass State Police.
Oh, did you enjoy that?
Yes.
Good.
Yes. Good days and bad days.
I hear you, James. We all have those days. And that's a wrap for this edition of the Page Publishing Book Club. Hope you are enjoying this crazy holiday season. Hey, maybe there's a Page Publishing book you can put in a stocking, or maybe you'll finally decide to give yourself the gift of time to sit down and write that book you've been meaning to write for how long now? We have a whole new set of authors coming up. And remember, you can hear us anytime you want when you download our shows at 710WOR.iHeart.com. I'm Alice Stockton Rossini. We'll see you next time.